Welcome back, everyone, to the 2016 Hack Summit. And for our final session today on Tuesday, February 23rd, we're joined by Bonnie Eisenman, who's currently a software engineer at Twitter. And she has also worked as a software engineer for Code Academy, Google, and Fog Creek Software, which was Joel Spolsky's company for incubating technology ideas. She graduated from Princeton, studying computer science in 2014, and she's the author of a book called Learning React Native. And she's also a volunteer teacher and teaches introductory programming classes to New York City high school students. So Bonnie, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So Bonnie's going to be giving a presentation to us today on React Native, and I think this is a very timely subject for everyone. And so I'll let Bonnie take it away. And Bonnie, I'll be here on mute. So if you have any questions or if you need anything, just call me and I'll be here. And we'll do Q&A with the audience afterwards.
All right, sounds great. Thanks, Ed. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be with you here today. I'm going to switch over to screen share now so I can show you my slides. So let's get that up. All right. So you should all be able to see my presentation. Like Ed said, today I'm going to be talking to you about React Native, sort of going into an overview of what it is, why you should use it, why you should care, and then also how it works. So to talk to you a little bit about the technical underpinnings. And then also its implications for mobile development in general, because I think it has a lot of interesting lessons for us beyond just the very practical bits of building mobile apps. So before we begin, Ed introduced me, but I'm a software engineer at Twitter in New York. I'm the author of Learning React Native, which came out via O'Reilly about a month ago. And it's been really exciting getting to really dig deep into React Native over the last year. It was released almost a year ago. And so I'm happy to have that book out in the wild. So you can find me on the internet, as you might expect, for a Twitter engineer. I'm on Twitter as @Brindell. You can also find me at my website, bonnieeisenman.com, which is where I put my projects, other talks I've given, stuff like that. And if you want to refer to these slides later, I've tweeted them out. You should also see them on the Hack Summit Twitter channel, but the link is also here, bit.ly/reactnative Hack Summit. So should be pretty easy to remember. All right. So with that out of the way, let's dig into some things. So to start with, what is React Native? Seems like the logical place to begin. Because I think a lot of people have heard of React Native, have heard a little bit of the hype around it, but still probably have a lot of questions about what it actually is and what it does. So my one-line summary of that: React Native is a way of using JavaScript to write truly native cross-platform applications for iOS and Android. And so I'm going to break this down a little bit, right? So the JavaScript part is kind of interesting. With React Native, every web developer, every JavaScript writer becomes a potential mobile developer. And specifically, React Native, as you might expect from the name, is about using React, React.js, the JavaScript library, for this. And then the part that gives React Native its name is that it lets you write truly native applications. So unlike some other approaches, like, say, Cordova, which basically create a glorified web view that your application lives inside of, React Native apps actually run by invoking the real platform APIs that you would use for normal mobile development. And it's a pretty cool feat of technology that they're able to do this. And we'll dig into later on in this talk exactly how that's possible. And then the cross-platform part is what's got a lot of people really excited, because you can do this for iOS and Android. You can have one code base with almost total code reuse, or in some cases, actual 100% code reuse. I deployed a flashcard app to the App Store and the Play Store with 100% of the same code. And it runs on iOS and Android. And so this is sort of the holy grail of mobile app development. It's something that people have wanted for a little while, for quite a while. The ability to not have to specialize in the arcane knowledge of specifically how do I write for iOS, specifically how do I write for Android. Keeping these things as separate silos has a lot of obvious disadvantages. React Native tries to bridge that gap. So that's React Native in a nutshell. That's the pitch. This is why people are interested in it, why it's exciting. Yeah, it's a pretty awesome thing. And one of the reasons this matters so much is that mobile is so important, right? Increasingly, we see that people interact with our websites and our products and all these things via mobile apps. Having a top-notch mobile app is super important. And the key part with React Native is that it lets us take our existing knowledge of JavaScript and all of the existing strengths of that ecosystem. I know people like to bash on JavaScript, but there's actually a lot of strength there. And it gives us a better way of writing mobile apps. This isn't just training wheels. This is actually, I would argue, a very compelling alternative to traditional mobile app development, regardless of your background. So no matter who you are, if you're coming at this from a web developer standpoint and you want to get into writing mobile, or you're already writing mobile and you want to write better apps more quickly with more code sharing, I think that React Native has a lot to offer you. So that's the high-level overview. In order to understand a bit more about React Native, I think it's useful to step back for a minute and talk about React. So this is the React logo. If you haven't heard of React before, or if you've heard of it and you're not quite sure what it is, simply put, React is just a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And with normal web development, we've got HTML, CSS, and JavaScript working together to create these rich websites. JavaScript is what lets us write interactive websites. The reason for all of these JavaScript libraries and frameworks is that sometimes we want to write something a little more complicated, an app on the scale of, say, a Netflix or a Facebook. And I use these examples because Netflix, for instance, has been very, very outspoken about their adoption of React. What we call the user interface often involves a lot more than just like a really nice design. For an application like Netflix or Facebook, these are basically single-page web apps, or SPAs. And the user interface really is the experience and is the product in a pretty major way. So there's these complicated problems to be solved on the front end that are super core to people's businesses. And out of the box, we've got fairly limited tools. This is why people use JavaScript frameworks, right? Because we have all these problems that need solving. So React sort of fits into the genre of libraries or frameworks that exist to solve that. So React came out in 2013. It was open sourced by Facebook. We saw a teeny bit of adoption, and then 2014 things really start to take off, and it just keeps growing in popularity. Excuse me. So React has a lot of hype around it right now. People are really excited about it. But at the same time, right, like this is JavaScript land. People have to have a reason to switch to things, right? There's been a meme going around the last few weeks about JavaScript fatigue, sparked by some Medium posts. And for all that people complain about JavaScript fatigue, there's a real reason for it, right? Like, why would you switch to React when you had your pick of a ton of other frameworks? So when React came onto the scene, like we already had a pretty crowded field. There was Backbone, Meteor, Knockout, Ember, Polymer, Angular. Angular, of course, being, I think, pretty far and away one of the most popular alternatives. All of these things already existed. And I think the key thing to note is that they're all solving slightly different problems, and they have different opinions about what the solutions should be to those problems, or even about how to formulate the problems. So React sort of emerges into this existing ecosystem, and despite the fact that it's a crowded field, really takes off. This makes sense, right? Your tools should solve real problems. And if they do solve real problems, then it's worth the overhead to adopt them, right? So why React? Understanding why React, the JavaScript framework, took off is going to be pretty key to understanding why it's worth listening to in the mobile context with React Native. So the first one that I think React made its claim to fame on was speed and performance. And so specifically with the kind of applications that tend to adopt React, what we see is that they've got a ton of different kinds of user interaction. They're very responsive. They change and update and re-render in response to the users doing all sorts of things. There's lots of stuff going on the page, right? You think about your Facebook feed. There are so many components on that page. Manipulating the DOM, the document object model, is expensive. So having a JavaScript framework that does that well is important. You want to build a snappy web app. React has a lot of features that contribute to that. So a lot of its early success in particular, I think, is attributable to its claims to being really, really performant. The next one is something that I think was often glossed over initially by people who were considering adopting it. And that's that components are actually a pretty natural way to think about how we build user interfaces. So the atomic unit of a user interface in React, like the smallest bit of your project, is what's called a component. And this is just something that renders onto the screen. And what this means is that the way that you do things in React, you're talking about little bits of user interface, which is actually pretty similar to how I think we naturally try to build user interfaces. We're not working in like some MVC framework kind of opinion, even though your applications might eventually end up looking like that. And so what we get from this is that React components are highly performant. We've got this declarative markup for them. They're composable, they're modular, and it becomes a pretty natural way to build websites, and also has the added benefits of nudging you into writing better code, which is one of the things that I think becomes more obvious as you work with React more, is that sort of the natural tendency is away from spaghetti and towards more modular UIs. So that's cool. And the other thing is that React puts the focus back on the view. A lot of existing JavaScript frameworks were pretty opinionated about how they solved the entire problem of how you would structure your web application. React, in contrast, claims to be just about the view. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have to solve the other problems, but React is very much focused on what is rendering onto the page and how it looks and how it behaves. And I think that this is just a more natural abstraction for a lot of people who are doing front-end work. Okay, cool. So that's what gets us to this adoption curve. And so React comes out 2013, 2014, 2015. We are seeing the curve continuing to slope upward. So that's pretty awesome, right? And so this is happening off in JavaScript land. To understand how we bring this over to mobile, we need to talk a little bit about components, and specifically about the virtual DOM and how React renders components. So components, like I said, they're the smallest piece of user interface in a React application. If you haven't seen JSX before, this syntax is going to look a bit strange. I promise it's going to be okay. So what we have here is a mixture of JavaScript and then markup, because a React component co-locates those things. So we create a React component with react.createClass, and then we have this render function. And what the render function does is it returns a bit of HTML-looking syntax markup. It says, hello, so-and-so. And you can see that that depends on a property of the component, in this case, name. If I wanted to use it, I'd say hello message, name equals Bonnie. And this will actually render to the screen, hello, Bonnie. The cool part about this is that this is actually a pretty descriptive and functional way of creating a component. And you'll notice that nowhere in here do we actually modify the document object model, the DOM. So we have this render function, but we ourselves are not actually manipulating the web page in order to get our greeting to appear. We leave that to React. So the way that this works is that React has something called the virtual DOM, which tries to keep a concept of how your application ought to look in memory. And then React actually handles messing with the browser DOM for you. So your components describe how they ought to render using this render function, and then React will invoke that for you. So what happens when something changes? When something changes, React notices. It then figures out the minimal amount necessary it has to do to re-render something. So it computes the diff in the virtual DOM. And then it plucks out the minimum number of nodes necessary and re-renders them in the actual browser DOM. Okay, so that seems pretty simple, right? Like React looks at what has to change and then it makes the change. But the important thing to notice is that I, the developer who's using React, never have to touch the DOM myself. We have a full, clean abstraction layer between a description of how my component ought to look and then the actual work that controls the rendering. And so this abstraction layer is very clean. It's, non-permeable. It's pretty great. Okay, so the key insight then is, wait, why do we have to render to the DOM at all? There's nothing in this process that means that we have to actually be working within a browser. And this is sort of the key insight that leads to React Native. So React Native is just React. it's almost entirely just React, except it takes place in on mobile instead of in the browser. So the way that this works in the browser is you've got a component, you tell React how it should look, React does the work to render it for you on a web page. With React Native, you have a component, you tell React Native how it ought to look, and then React Native goes and it has this thing called the bridge that then talks to the native iOS or Android APIs and actually renders it for you. And so this is really the key part that allows React to function on mobile and on any platform, really. The key part is that you need the bridge. So React Native has this internal representation of how your component ought to look, and then the bridge goes and does the work. So same deal as on the web. When something changes, React computes the diff. After it computes the diff, it figures out the minimal amount it has to do to re-render, and then it re-renders it. And this is only possible because JavaScript engines on mobile have come a really, really long way in the last few years. And so React can do all of this work of computing how your application ought to look off of the main UI thread. So there's, you don't have the negative performance implications. And then from the JavaScript engine, React can actually invoke the real rendering APIs. And what this means is that even though, you're writing JavaScript, React is talking to the host platform, and it's doing that on your behalf. So the crux of it is that you describe your UI with React, and React handles the rendering for you, and therefore it's actually native, hence the name, as you'd expect, right? It's really easy to not realize that this is what's going on under the hood, right? There's just this black magic, and suddenly you have an app. But I think it's really important to call out how this is different from other existing JavaScript for mobile approaches. Because to date, almost every other approach has focused on using JavaScript and using HTML on mobile to write actual JavaScript and HTML on mobile that then live within a glorified web view. That's sort of the status quo of cross-platform, web-inspired mobile development. With React Native, this is literally a native application, even though you, the developer, don't usually need to think about that. That being said, React Native is not entirely the same as React for web. So when I say React, I mean React for the web. When I say React Native, I mean for mobile. And there's this very tight analogy between them, but they're not entirely identical. So what I'm going to go into now is some more stuff in general about what it's like to actually use React Native and how these things differ from the web development experience. So the first and perhaps biggest difference is that your basic components are different. So in the browser DOM, we describe things with divs, we might have image tags, we might have spans or paragraphs, we might have lists. And these are all basic HTML elements that we tell our React components to render for us. On mobile, we have similar and tightly analogous but slightly different components. So we have a view, an image, a text, a list view. All of these things exist on mobile. But they actually end up rendering to the real native versions of themselves. So a view might render on iOS to a UI view or to an Android view. And these things are actually invoking real APIs. So that's how it works. That's like the technical underpinnings that make React Native possible. Using React Native is sort of an interesting adjustment if you're coming at this from either a web development-based background or from a traditional mobile background. So I'm going to run through a couple of the major differences between other kinds of development. So first, in addition to like your very basic like view, image, text, list view things that you might expect to exist, we also have things like date pickers, right? There's all these different kinds of mobile interface components that Apple or Google provide to us via their standard APIs. And with React Native, you can just use them, right? They're included in the framework. If they're not included in the framework, then you just need to add them to the bridge for them to work, and that's actually something you can totally do on your own. I included an example of this in the book if you'd like to see. So when I tell React that I want the state picker, React Native says, sure, okay, and it goes and invokes the actual date picker rendering API. So if you've ever used like the calendar app on iOS, this will be a familiar series of wheels, right? And quite literally, you don't need to reinvent this wheel. It's just there, and you just get to use it, which is pretty great. And increasingly, a lot of native APIs are accessible this way. But it's not just native UI components that you get. You also get all the other native APIs. So for example, if you want to access the camera roll so that you can get the user's photo, if you want to access the location so that you can get the user's location, React Native also provides us with access to these things. And it's as simple as a couple of lines of JavaScript. You say, hey, I want the user location. React Native says, sure, let me go get that for you, and gives you the user's location. In this example, after prompting the user for their permission, of course. And so this is pretty cool. So if you've ever worked with iOS or Android, you know that the APIs provided by Apple and Google are pretty enormous. There is a lot there. Not all of it is ported to React Native yet. But again, all you have to do is add the little bit of bridge code to teach React Native how to invoke it. And then, the world is your oyster, basically. The other interesting bit is styling. So on React for Web, we use CSS. You might not think that you would use CSS on mobile. But we need some way to style our applications, and we need a common language for it. So on iOS and Android, there are different style APIs. There's different ways of laying out views and handling all of that stuff. We need a standardized way. But like CSS, really, right? Like I did a Giphy search for CSS, and this is the first one that came up. You could argue that this is accurate. This was the second thing that came up. I kind of can envision CSS as a prickly pufferfish too. That being said, yeah, no, CSS is actually how we're going to style our mobile apps. If you want to read further about how CSS is perhaps not the most pleasant of experiences, there's a link there to Vijay's CSS in JS talk. But what it boils down to is that for all that I'm making fun of CSS a little bit, it actually has some really awesome characteristics. And also, there's a lot of people who already understand it. So what React Native does is it takes CSS and it shrinks it down. It implements a subset of CSS to try and stop you from shooting yourself in the foot with it. And actually, the end result is pretty awesome. So like it relies heavily on Flexbox for layout. You can't get into all of the awful wars of interfering positioning rules that CSS kind of naturally lends itself to. Instead, you've got Flexbox. And so pretty quickly you can lay out, whatever things you need. You just use these JavaScript-ish, object-ish looking things, and you apply them to your React components. And so when you're learning React Native, yes, learning to style things will take a little bit of time, but the end result is actually highly expressive. It does basically everything you need to do, and it's quite easy to learn, especially if you've already picked up some CSS before. So this is an example of a weather app that users build within the first couple chapters of my book. And pretty quickly you get used to doing things like using Flexbox to move stuff around, and it styles your mobile components. And the advantages we get from this is that we have one consistent styling API that works on iOS, on Android, and even on web. You can use the subset of CSS on web and just use your style sheets more or less directly. And so this is a screenshot from the flashcard app that users build during one of the last chapters of my book. And, okay, you've got these buttons, you've got these different screens, a header, whatever. All this boils down to a tree of React components. And if you've worked with React before, then, you already know how to compose complicated user interfaces out of these kinds of components. And it all pretty much just works as you'd expect. The other big question people often have is how does developer setup work? So we're going to dig into that a little bit now. Basically, what do you need to do to get started working with React Native? Do you need any special licenses? What do you have to install? All this stuff. So I have some good news and some bad news for you. The good news, it's just normal mobile development, but with JavaScript. The bad news, it's just normal mobile development, but with JavaScript. And if you've done mobile development before, you may find this slightly entertaining. you end up with a lot of windows on your screen. And the reason for this is that you're basically working with standard iOS development, standard Android development, and then standard JavaScript React development on top of that. And what that means is you'll need to install Xcode. You'll need to install the Android developer tools, although not Android Studio. We'll be using the Android command line tools. You'll need to set up NPM, install React Native, and then React provides this like magical boilerplate generating command, React Native init. And you start up this little packager that handles your JavaScript code. And then boom, you've got a project. Now, this is pretty great for some reasons, right? Like you get to use whatever JavaScript editor you're most comfortable with. For me personally, I bounce between Sublime and Vim. But, you know, whichever floats your boat. And then you need the node manager running, and then you need, depending on if you're testing on iOS or Android, Xcode running, and the simulator, and perhaps your real device plugged in via USB. It can get a little bit unwieldy. But this all makes sense because this is just, again, the totally standard mobile development environment plus a JavaScript text editor, basically. It's also worth noting that iOS development requires you to have a Mac. If you're not running OS X, you're not really going to be able to do iOS development. But if you just want to do Android or Windows development, you can get away with, if you just want to do Android development, you can get away with using Windows or Linux. So React Native has experimental support for developing on Windows and Linux. This is seen as a community responsibility. So the core team does not usually work on that. It's left up to the community. But that being said, you should still be able to get to work. So speaking of emulators, right, you'll see on the right that that's an example iPhone emulator running. There's some awesome stuff about this setup that you don't get from normal mobile development. The biggest one is this reload button. So normally, if you've done any kind of iOS or Android dev before, you probably know the pain of realizing that you want to adjust that thing by just maybe 5 pixels to the left. No, wait, 3 pixels to the right. No, you want to debug it. And then having to recompile your entire application to test it. Now, some build systems sure do some caching, but still, when I've done iOS and Android development in the past at Google and Fog Creek Software, respectively, what you find is that rebuilding your application will take anywhere from 1 minute to 5 to 10 to, if you're unlucky, much longer than that. And I kind of don't want to have reason to use that awful XKCD compiling cartoon because it's a bit too real. The awesome thing about React Native is that this is just JavaScript. All of your control code is in JavaScript, which means that you can just hit refresh and instantly reload the new version of your application. So that's pretty awesome and is honestly one of the biggest wins that one gets from developing with React Native. You shake your device or you hit F5 on the simulator or Command R, whatever it is. And this menu pops up, you hit reload, and you have your new app. That's it, done, no waiting. And this really shortens the cycle of iteration and gets you to this tighter feedback loop. That's really awesome. Okay, cool. Next thing, debugging in React Native. You get to use the normal browser debug tools. So while yes, you can use like native iOS and Android debug tools if you need to, like say if you're using a hybrid app, like that's totally fine. But for your debugging your React code, you debug your React Native code the same way you would debug React code. So you can open up the Chrome debug tools, attach them to the simulator, and then you can even like use the debugger to pause inside of your React Native components. So that's pretty awesome. You can also use inspect element and all this other stuff. And the net result is that you get to use the same JavaScript style developer tools that you're accustomed to using when you're working with React for the web. So that part's pretty great. Excuse me. So the other thing that people often ask me about, how does deploying work? And can you really deploy these things? Is it really more than just a toy? I'm here today to tell you that yes, you can. So for the flashcard app that I've been showing you screenshots of, I deployed this to both the iOS App Store and the Google Play Store. The deploy process is super, super simple. You basically have to bundle your JavaScript code, which is more or less a one-liner for both iOS and Android. And so that part is pretty easy. You bundle it up, you build your app for production, you ship it off to the App Store. This is the part where anyone who's done any iOS before is probably cringing a little bit because so iOS store approval times take around 2 weeks. Google Play Store approval times take usually under 48 hours. And that's exactly what I experienced with this application. You don't pay a penalty for using React Native. It does not impact your review experience. And then you've actually got your real working app into the hands of users, and that's a pretty awesome feeling. You can also use the ordinary means of distributing apps for beta testing to your test users. So whether or not that's sending them a signed APK for Android and like just emailing it out to your friends, or distributing it through a more mature like beta testing framework like TestFlight, all of that totally doable, proceeds as normal. Or mostly proceeds as normal. There's one part I lied, I'm sorry, but this is actually awesome. Over-the-air updates are possible with React Native, and this is a unique benefit of working in JavaScript land. So over-the-air updates. Apple revised their policy about a year ago, I want to say. And what you can do is you're allowed to ship any JavaScript-only update to your application without going through the review process. This is pretty amazing. Instead of having to wait 2 weeks to ship that bug fix for your iOS app, now you can actually just ship it out via JavaScript over the air, and it'll work. This is all highly experimental stuff. It's worth flagging that you shouldn't necessarily be relying on this to work perfectly, but there's a lot of people trying to solve this problem, and I expect that we'll see a lot more of this in the coming months. So here, for instance, we've got Exponent.js and Microsoft's Code Push. These are new technologies, but quickly, garnering a lot of interest and early adoption. And so I'm really excited to see where they go. And again, these allow you to take an update to your React Native app and ship it out to your users without requiring them to go through the process of updating your application. So that's pretty great. So that's like the whirlwind tour of what it's like to work with React Native. Feels kind of magic, like especially that over-the-air update thing. Oh my goodness, so excited. So for the most part, working with React Native is just like working with React for the web. If you've used React on the web, you're going to feel pretty comfortable. If you haven't used React for the web, you're going to want to do that before you tackle React Native, because there's a lot of mobile-specific stuff that you will also have to learn. If you've done zero React Native before, what you need to do is become familiar with the component lifecycle and how props and state work before you touch the native stuff. But you should be able to run through that really quickly. The other notable factors. There's a standardized styling API that looks a lot like CSS, except that for the part where it's actually pretty pleasant to work with. And that's the same on iOS and Android, lets you write apps that render the way you want. And the other bits are, tied up in the name, right? We get native performance and look and feel. You are able to write top quality iOS and Android apps without having to compromise, just so that you can work with React Native. So that's awesome. You get native API access. So that means being able to natively access things like the camera or the user's location without, having to be constrained into this segregated JavaScript land. You get a faster development process because you're able to instantly refresh your code. You're able to push updates out over the air. There's all these ways in which React Native helps close the iteration loop and get you working faster. And all of this stuff is pretty great. So what's it mean? The implications of this will vary a lot based on what you're doing. So let's talk a bit about the context in which React Native exists in. So number one, mobile is hard. Building excellent mobile experiences is really difficult. You have to worry about a lot of different things, whether or not that's battery life or performance or touch targets. But also, pretty critically, I think, developing on mobile is in some ways about working in a hostile environment. You're playing in somebody else's walled garden. And because of this, what we see is that, sometimes it feels like mastering iOS or Android development is about learning all of these strange arcane incantations while standing on a bed of quicksand. Apologies to those of you who think that's an exaggeration. It probably is, as are most hyperboles. But that being said, the developer experience matters a lot. The more our tools can improve and the better that the developer experience gets, the more interesting things we can build. I think that's a pretty basic thing that most people would be on board with. And especially as mobile becomes increasingly important, the developer experience really in some ways dictates what kinds of stuff we're going to be inclined to try and do. So earlier I said your tools should solve real problems. React, I think, has succeeded as a JavaScript framework in large part because it does this. React Native, similarly, has real solutions to actual problems. The biggest one is no more code silos, right? You don't have to keep your iOS and your Android developers working on totally separate feature sets and trying desperately to haul them together. You can also even share a lot of code across iOS, Android, and web, though I didn't talk about that today. And you can get that code sharing without compromising on quality. None of this, you're locked inside of a little WebView business. No, your React Native apps can actually work. There's a quicker feedback cycle. You've got more tools. You have, full use of debugging and good error messages and all of that. And critically, you can also drop down to native development when you need it. If you need to write a super high-performing module, like doing some crazy graphics processing that you just have to do natively, you can do that. React Native allows you to integrate with Objective-C or Swift or Java or whatever's appropriate, and you actually get that, which is pretty great. All right. So that being said, what's the catch? Is this all just hype? Am I just shouting hype at you? I totally get that a lot of people's instinct is to be skeptical of this stuff. And in some ways that's fair, because, this is a very new technology. The API is not yet complete. Getting started can be a bit confusing. The community is still discovering best practices. But that being said, I want to show you this graph. This graph, I think, is pretty interesting. I totally ripped this off of someone's Medium post. Apologies. And what this is showing is tracking React Native's interest, according to Google Trends, versus iOS development. And we can see, React Native has been out for almost exactly 1 year. And yet, already, it's overtaking iOS dev. I said before that, tool fatigue is real. And, people don't just switch over to a new thing just because it's new and shiny, especially when that new thing inspires amazing talks like this one. We know that JavaScript has problems. We know that lots of people are reluctant to pick up something to do with it. And yet the draw of React Native is powerful enough that I think a lot of people are starting to see that this is actually an awesome way to do mobile development. And people are choosing to work on it for mobile over traditional mobile development. This is the real deal, right? I think if nothing else, the surge of interest that we've seen in React Native, as well as based on my own experiences working with it over the past year, show us that React Native is really here to stay, or at the very least, for today, it solves some of our problems and it solves them very, very well. And again, I think this points to the fact that developer experience matters, and React Native represents a very large step up over the status quo. So now that we've covered up to where we are now, what's coming next? And I especially want to ask this question because, like I said earlier, React Native was released almost exactly a year ago. At ReactConf 2015, I was fortunate enough to be there as a speaker, and the team blew us all away when they announced this thing. But it was super new and super immature. They just released a private beta of it. And now this year, ReactConf actually is just wrapping up literally as I speak. And, a lot has happened in a year. The framework has matured. People are building real things with it. So what's coming up next in 2016? One thing I'm curious about is to see if we get to more platforms, right? Anyone can write a so-called bridge. So, people are experimenting with React Native for desktop, right? Like write native Windows apps or native OS X apps. That would be awesome. Port it to your Apple Watch. I don't know. Port it to your DVD player. There's a lot of things that could happen here, and I'm really curious to see what people decide to do with it, because anyone can do this. I also expect that we'll see more solutions to the biggest outstanding common problems, whether that's stronger gesture handling or better animation APIs. Over-the-air updates, I think we're going to see a lot of movement on in the next few months. Tool simplification would be pretty awesome, like make it easier to get started. Right now, this is in a good state, but not great. But I think probably the biggest thing that's going to happen is just stuff we can't predict yet, right? Like a year ago, React Native didn't exist. People are using it today to build production apps, and it's absolutely at the point where it's production ready. But I think we're right on the cusp of people starting to experiment with using it to do some really, really cool things. And I, at least, am very much looking forward to seeing where that goes. Cool. So that's what I got for you. I'm really excited about React Native. I think that it has been an amazing experience to work with it. And I am really, really looking forward to hearing from all of you about what you think. And how you think React Native is useful to you, or heck, what you think is really not useful to you. So talk to me. I'm at Burdell on Twitter. You can buy my book. You get a 40% off coupon with code OFFD. And with that being said, thank you so much for having me here today.
Bonnie, that was amazing. Incredible talk. I learned a lot from that. Wow. I had no idea that React Native had so much traction on Google searches. That's really surprising. That's higher than iOS development. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's not something I think a lot of people expected. I think, we have a natural tendency to think of it as like JS training wheels for real mobile, but people are choosing it over native mobile development more and more, which Absolutely. I'm really excited about.
So I've got a few questions that I want to ask, because this actually touches close to home for me, because a long time ago, I was actually making HTML5 hybrid apps, and I was very curious about that space. I loved the vision of A/B testing apps and circumventing the App Store approval process and write once, run anywhere across Android and iOS. Or it kind of reminds me of back in the Java days when we would build Java applications that would run on Unix as well as Windows. And so that value proposition resonates very strongly with me. And I was a little bit disappointed by the various vendors that were doing HTML5 hybrid back in the day. So let me ask you a few questions here to see how React Native kind of stacks up here. So so first of all, can you so is Apple okay with the idea of you doing substantial changes to your application that are not bug fixes, but are actually kind of like new content releases and new feature functionality, and bypass the App Store approval process? Because the reason why I ask that is because it's Apple's mission to guard their customers against potentially unsafe content that might violate the spirit of the App Store. So has that been explored at all?
So the interesting thing about Apple's iOS approval process, right, is that it is in many ways opaque. So they can change their rules at any time. But a year ago, they released, I think I have the timing right, they made this really interesting announcement to the effect that, hey, if it's JavaScript, we hands off, whatever, do whatever you want. And I think a lot of people are interpreting the spirit of that to be that you can make, major changes to your app, and it'll all be fine as long as it's JavaScript only. I expect that we'll start to see a little bit more nuance around the way that Apple handles that. I think everyone is still trying to grapple with what's even possible. But I mean, I know people who have successfully pushed out major features via JavaScript over the air. So it's pretty exciting.
So if that is truly possible, then doesn't that like, let's take the extreme case here. Doesn't this kind of incentivize us to build as much as we can in JavaScript, and to have our entire app itself just be kind of like an empty shell that's just kind of a host to JavaScript, so that we can now do our entire applications in JavaScript and have them be dynamically loaded and updated on the fly, with even our contents and our assets potentially coming over the air as well? Like, can you do that? Can you actually have your images, your sound effects, all those also be downloaded with the JavaScript, or is it only the code that you can update?
I'm not sure. I don't believe I think that you can already download your assets over the air and change all of that.
Okay.
I think that's sort of a separate policy. But yeah, it does create some interesting incentives. I think we all have to be careful a little bit about the way this evolves, because like you said, why not just download everything over the air? I think that this is going to be an interesting sort of tug of war and balance between, especially that exciting thing for developers, and then looking out for your users who might say have very limited data plans and not expect you to suddenly download like a 100 megabyte app update or whatever. So I don't know. I think the answer is that no one is quite sure how Apple's going to react, and everyone is expecting them to react more as this becomes more prevalent. The Play Store, as usual, is a lot more lenient, and I think people are less skittish around that.
So here's a few kind of standard questions that all frameworks, I think, have to kind of address, right? Because there's always like a little bit of skepticism. Bob Martin was here earlier today. He's kind of a little bit against frameworks in general. And always he encouraged our audience to look at frameworks with a jaded eye, I believe was his exact language, right? So looking at that with a jaded eye, let's go explore a little bit here. So let's say we try to get write once, run anywhere across iOS and Android with React Native. Do you think that's truly possible, given that there are feature functionality and platform differences, screen size differences, button differences between those two platforms? Like, wouldn't it naturally make sense that you would actually have a somewhat divergent code path between those two platforms?
So absolutely. And I think that the goal should not be write once, run anywhere. I think that most of your business logic, sure, is going to be shareable, but to build a really excellent mobile app for iOS or Android, you need to have platform-specific code. So like, I think a simple example is tab bars, I believe, on iOS usually appear at the bottom of the screen, and on Android, everyone expects them to appear at the top, right? The cool thing with React Native is it makes it super easy to have a small part of your app be platform-specific. So I can write a wrapper that's like the navigation component or whatever and tell it to do this thing on iOS and do this thing on Android. And it's really simple. And that's what you're seeing a lot of people do. So Facebook, for example, with their ads manager app has something like 83% code reuse, because some of the time you want it to look different. And I think having that flexibility is really important. And knowing when to break out of sort of this sort of developer-centric, but what if we just made it simple sort of thing, and focus on making an excellent experience for your users.
If this really starts to take off, I could see a whole ecosystem of A/B testing tools being built on React Native. Like, I could see lots of tool vendors emerging in a whole space here, potentially.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that develops, because, there's so much room for it. We're still trying to figure out a lot of things first that I think has to happen. Like, for example, how do you import a third-party library that includes JavaScript code, Xcode configurations, and then like Android build configurations? So it's, there's a lot of things for people to solve, and I think a lot of people are taking hacks at it.
Okay, so here's the next question. So I like the idea of debugging in the browser. That's cool. Now, what happens when I have to dive into a native library? Do I then need to change my debugging stack and my debugging environment to Xcode for that? And how can I grapple with that as a developer? How do I trace through a program that swaps contexts like that?
So I think this is why it's really important that if you're working with React Native in the kind of context where you're going to be like bringing in outside native libraries and that kind of thing, you really do have a responsibility for understanding how your framework works under the hood. And this is where the whole you should be skeptical of frameworks thing, I think, is a very, very valid point. Because yeah, absolutely. If there's native code executing in Objective-C and you need to debug it, you're going to have to do that the way you usually debug Objective-C code. You're going to have to use the ordinary debugger for that. The good news is that if you know how React Native works, you'll be able to isolate that from the rest of your app. And so you'll say, okay, and you'll close Chrome and you'll close your JavaScript bits and you'll figure out what's going on with the Objective-C part.
So would the process, let's say that does happen to me, would the process be then to open up Xcode and then to somehow simulate the invocation on the API that React was trying to do on the native code with similar parameters to step through it? Is that kind of what you would do?
Yeah, I think so you're going to have Xcode open if you're running on iOS regardless. And I think ideally what you would be able to do would be like, catch the invocation that's wrong, then replay it, and then all of this. But yeah, as with anything, when you add another layer on top, now you have another layer to debug. So I think you have exactly the right intuition around how that would play out.
Okay, makes sense. Great. And then, so last question is, if you kind of look at the broader ecosystem of options that developers have, we've got HTML5, HTML5 hybrid, and then we've got systems like Appcelerator, which also are JavaScript based, which are more proprietary ecosystems that have been trying to solve similar problems for a while. So given the advent of React Native, what's your prediction? Do you think that React Native is going to kind of displace some of the developers that are currently using alternative frameworks? Do you think that it's a strict upgrade for them? Like, what's your prediction of the future here? Is this a coexisting ecosystem, or is this going to actually replace these other options over time? What do you think? And I know that you're a little bit biased here because you wrote the book on this, but maybe if you were to take a step back and say, okay, let's be objective here. What do you think is realistic?
I think that's a really great question. I think that people are going to do whatever delivers value for them and for their work. So with a lot of the existing approaches, right, you have certain advantages. Like if you're writing it just as a HTML app, then you're able to, like, in a lot of ways, just treat it exactly like your mobile site. And so React Native, for instance, is not there, right? You have to have different components on mobile, even though it looks really similar. But I think in general, what we're going to see is that for most of them, the value you get is that it's cross-platform and that it looks like the web, so web developers can learn it, and you can share stuff really easily. And for those cases, React Native is in many ways a strict upgrade. So I don't think that React Native is going to totally destroy or whatever, overtake the other options. But I think what's going to probably happen is it's going to force the other options to develop alternative ways of showing that they're providing this extra benefit on top of what you would get if you use something like React Native. We've seen this happen with React in web development land, right? React had this big performance claim to fame with the way that it did the virtual DOM. And then we see other frameworks adopting similar ideas and a really awesome cross-pollination of ideas between all of them. So we end up with a stronger and more diverse ecosystem overall.
Great, thank you, Bonnie. Okay, so we're just about out of time here, but I want to go quickly through the poll here. So have you done mobile development before? If so, what platforms? And 34% of our audience has not done any mobile development. But then about a third of our audience has done Android, and about 1/6 of our audience has done iOS development. So that's kind of how it breaks out here. And then there's also some audience members who have used Titanium, Cordova, and actually 6.7% of our audience has used React Native. How cool is that?
That's really neat. Yeah,
Pretty neat, huh?
It's awesome to think that this is a thing that didn't even exist a year ago.
Yeah.
And here we are.
So a few audience questions here. What are the downsides of developing with React Native? Can you quickly, maybe just 3 quick bullet points for what you think the biggest downsides are?
Sure. So I think one, like you said, it's another layer on top of things. So that's going to make your app more complex and is going to occasionally make developing more difficult. 2, it's a new technology. This means that the API isn't always complete. Best practices aren't always known. So you're going to have to still be able to, say, dip down into Swift, Objective-C, or Java to fix some things occasionally. I think that's it for the most part. And also just that you have to adopt wholesale React's way of doing certain things like styling. And that means that if you're coming at it for mobile development, now you have a new thing to learn. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And then next question. I guess we kind of hinted at this earlier. There's a slightly different spin on that question. Do you think cross-platform development will overcome native development for iOS and Android in the near future? And that's especially relevant given how Apple just open sourced Swift and put it in GitHub, and how excited developers are these days about Swift, and how much they're seeing that as an improvement over Objective-C. So given that there's all this momentum right now behind Swift, and now there's this new choice of React Native, right? How do you think things will shake out ultimately?
I think that cross-platform development is sort of this thing that we've all been chasing and wanting for a really long time. And I think that regardless of if it overtakes native development, we're going to see a huge uptake of it. And also, the cool thing about React Native is that it doesn't mean not doing native mobile development. It just means doing it when it makes sense, instead of being forced into it. So I think my guess at what's going to happen is we're going to see probably that cross-platform app development is going to take off in a major way, but people are still always going to need to be able to do native development on iOS and Android.
Great, thank you, Bonnie. Well, Bonnie, I really want to express my appreciation for you being here today. It was very enlightening to learn about React Native from you, and I think our audience learned a lot. So thanks very much for being here. And afterwards, we'll have Bonnie take some questions in a private hangout. If you have time for that, Bonnie, is that right? You do have time for that?
I actually can't. It's
you don't?
It's
Okay.
9 p.m. here, so
all right.
I'm
Well,
gonna
maybe the audience can tweet questions at you then.
Yeah, I will be on Twitter, and we'll get to people there, and
Okay,
look
great.
forward to hearing what they say.
So I'm going to close up with some few parting words for today's event, and some quick tips of my own for developers. And so, overall, I thought today was an amazing day. And this was a day where we heard from some incredible speakers. So we started out today with John Skeet, the #1 answer on Stack Overflow. He had a fun sock puppet that he played with as he gave a presentation. It was awesome. And then Aaron Sconard came on board and taught us all about learning and education in the development space. And then Kent Beck, giving us incredible software development best practices, the creator of extreme programming and many design patterns and many books. It was just a thrill to have him here. Then Thomas Curran came on board, and Thomas taught us all about how to innovate within large companies and how they build software development at Oracle, which is absolutely fascinating. And then Joel Spolsky came on board and told us all about the challenge that he sees with Wikipedia and how you can build a development community in an effective way and some best practices he's learned over time. And then we were joined by Chi Liu, the Executive Vice President at Microsoft, and she gave us an incredible talk on how Microsoft is embracing open source and all the transformation that's happening within Microsoft and the contributions they've made these days and how they think about innovation. And then Jocelyn came on board, and she gave us a great talk on the right way to ship software, and it was just fascinating learning from her. And then the incredible Bob Martin came on board with a great talk on software craftsmanship and taught me and a lot of our audience members about how we can become more professional as software developers through the software craftsmanship movement. And Tom Chi then gave a great talk on maxing your mind and prototype thinking with Sai Hussain as the guest host. And then Bonnie, thank you for being here today with the great presentation on React Native. So this is just an incredible day. I mean, I could not have asked for a better day, and I think the speakers today were just absolutely outstanding. And I think the audience here agrees that this has just been an amazing event today. So I want to thank everyone for being here today, and I'll just close with a few tips of my own for developers. So this is kind of a few things that I learned along the way as a software developer that I thought might be handy, and just 3 quick tips here to think about as we wrap up today. So the first thing is, as a developer, I've noticed that it's difficult for me to actually get things done unless I focus on what's important. And I tend to divide the world of all the things I could be doing into 4 quadrants. So the first quadrant is the stuff that's urgent and the stuff that's important, urgent and important. So this is stuff where people are asking you to do it every day, and it's obviously important. And you're going to get this stuff done because it's urgent and it's important. Then there's the stuff that's urgent but not important. So what does that mean? It's stuff where other people are urging you to do it, and you feel the pressure to do it, but it's actually not important. Like, it's urgent because someone emailed you or someone called you or someone sent you an instant message. But if you really think about it, this is not in the critical path of what you need to really be doing right now, and you're getting distracted by this stuff. And this is where a lot of productivity can fall by the wayside, is instant messages, text messages, Slack messages, things that, I feel that being very guarded of your time with stuff that's urgent and not important is very critical to focusing and succeeding as an entrepreneur, as a developer, and anywhere in life. And then there's the category of stuff that's important but not urgent. And then there's the stuff that's not important and not urgent. So the stuff that's not important and not urgent, you're not going to do that. That's fine. No one does that stuff. But then what's really interesting is this category of stuff that's important but not urgent. So this is stuff that you know that you need to get done, but you haven't gotten it done because no one's made it urgent for you. Like, no one's telling you to do it, It's something that's on your list of things that you need to get done. And you know that if you do it, it's going to be a huge win. But you just don't do it because it's not urgent and no one's pushing you to do it. And so what I've noticed over time in my own career is that sometimes I fall prey to just reacting to others making things urgent for me and forgetting about the stuff that's not urgent but still important. And I notice that if I can focus on getting that stuff done and maybe ignoring some of the stuff that's not important but others are making urgent, then I can be much more successful in terms of getting projects finished. So that's basically kind of like the big kind of tip that I have for developers out there. That's number one. Number two is talking about this idea of social capital. So, so when I was younger, I was very focused on kind of physical capital. Physical capital, being money, making money, getting promoted, getting a raise, bonus, all that stuff, right? And then I started to realize over time that the world doesn't always operate off of physical capital. There's this other kind of capital called social capital, which is like this invisible capital that exists behind the scenes. And social capital is, the whole idea of social capital is that by building rapport and by building relationships with others, by doing them favors, and by being helpful and useful as a human being, you're kind of paying it forward. And so social capital is something to be very conscious of in life. I actually am very, very reticent to spend social capital. Social capital is something that I try to build as a piggy bank for as long as possible, and I only spend it if I need to. In fact, I'd rather probably spend physical capital than social capital sometimes. And so I kind of see the world in that way and try to look at it that way. And I've noticed that when I started to look at it that way, and a lot of my friends look at it that way too, that my life started to work a little bit better because of the focus on social capital. In fact, the Hack Summit itself would probably not have been possible without social capital, because myself plus a lot of colleagues that we help run the Hack Summit for, we actually cashed in a lot of social capital to get the introductions needed to have the speakers be here today. So just to be mindful of social capital. And the last tip is the whole idea of paying it forward. So Zig Ziglar, a very famous business development expert, said, you can have everything you want in life if you help everyone else get everything that they want in life. And this guy is a master at business development. So I've tried to apply that in my life through paying it forward. So the idea of kind of creating value before receiving value. And so paying it forward is just another good best practice that I think makes a lot of sense, both in software development, outside of software development, just a great practice in life. So anyway, I hope those tips were useful. I know it's a little bit different than the other engineering best practices that you may have learned today. But I think that as human beings, this is all stuff that we can all learn from. So anyway, I hope that was helpful. And tomorrow we've got an incredible lineup. I hope everyone has the chance to join us tomorrow. We've got a full day ahead of ourselves. It's going to be the final day of the Hack Summit. We're going to also have the hackathon results at the end of tomorrow and the closing ceremonies. So I hope everyone will have a chance to join us then. And Bonnie, thanks again for being here with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Okay, have a good night, guys. We'll see you tomorrow.